very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Follow the Sun, 24 hours of broadcasting right across the world, to celebrate the launch of the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022, produced in conjunction with the US News and Wharton Business School. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this session. This broadcast is going to travel right across the world, starting in New Zealand and ending 24 hours later in the USA. We have an absolutely packed broadcast today. This year's Best Countries study is our fullest and most comprehensive yet. The attitudes of global business leaders, opinion formers and citizens towards nation strengths has changed dramatically in recent years, never more so than in 2022. And we'll be looking at how those changes in values have impacted overall perceptions of our 85 nations covered in the 2022 study. But perceptions of a country only tell half the story. We'll then visit 24 countries to hear what's happening from WPP experts on the ground and sometimes how perceptions of a country don't really reflect the situation. Now, our time together promises to be informative, challenging, stimulating, and I hope fun. So let's get started. How a country is viewed around the world is of huge importance, politically, economically, and socially. It has the ability to contribute to both a nation's hard and soft power. The Romans understood this well. SPQR, an abbreviation for Centanus Populosque Romanus, was arguably the first country branding. It was an emblematic, abbreviated phrase referring to the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You only needed to see the emblem, and invaded countries knew exactly what was in store for them. So country branding itself is not new, but measuring it is. Now in our 7th year, the WPP BAV Annual Best Countries Rankings measures global perceptions of countries against a series of characteristics, impressions that have the potential to drive trade, travel and investment. They also directly affect brands. The study was developed by WPP BAV, the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania, and US News. The ranking is based on a large global survey which asks a range of people about how they perceive different countries against a range of key attributes. Country branding also has a significant impact on corporate and product brands. The words "made in" can instantly lend credibility and trust to a product or brand that a consumer hasn't previously encountered. That could be enough to convince someone to buy and beyond that, convince them to pay a premium. Likewise, "made in" can prove an instant turn-off if a consumer associates the country of origin with poor safety standards or sees it as being behind the times on social issues or workers' rights. But it's not just a one-way reaction. The perceptions and performance of brands abroad feedback into the development of the country itself. Additionally, willingness for corporates to invest vital FDI is also closely linked to the strength of a country's brand. As local brands and businesses succeed, they generate economic growth as well as lending further positive associations to their country's brand. There's a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brand they associate with that country. Strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. Think of France and Chanel. Both represent elegance, glamour and prestige. Chanel is intrinsically French and France is synonymous with Chanel. The same can be said of Italy and Ferrari, or Japan and Sony. In each case, brands and the countries are part of a virtuous circle, a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Germany is a really fine example of this symbiosis in action. Germany has come to represent the qualities of durability and engineering that brands like Bosch, BMW, Audi and Mercedes have shown the world that Germany can deliver. Brands can both shape and be shaped by the perceptions of their country of origins. Japan in the 1970s was known as a cheap manufacturing base, but now respected as a world leader for quality electronics and also technology, thanks largely to brands like Sony and Toyota. South Korea has taken a similar path, with Samsung and Hyundai demonstrating to the entire world what modern South Korea is and is doing, so creating consumer predisposition in international markets that favour other South Korean brands. There's a two-way reaction and a multiplier effect for both. This year's study quantifies the impact. We see that 83% of consumers globally agree that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. 78% also agree that the country a product is made in impacts my preference to purchase it. Our annual Best Countries ranking was first launched in 2016 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, the world's largest gathering of global leaders and heads of industry and influence. It's now in its 7th year, and given how turbulent the past 7 years have been across the globe, enables us to see the impact of the changes. The Best Country ranking incorporates the views of close to 18,000 individual members of the public and business decision makers, surveyed in 85 countries across the world. This year's survey was completed in mid-2022. Collectively, the 85 countries in the 2022 rankings account for about 95% of global gross domestic product per capita and represent 80% of the world's population. Individuals surveyed for Best Countries were asked how closely they associated 73 attributes with a range of countries. These attributes were then grouped into 10 categories that were used to calculate the Best Countries ranking, and more on those attributes later. So come with me as we meet our first guests on our interview stage. Well, I'm very delighted now to be joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Chief Economist of Goldman Sachs and a former government UK Minister and Chairman of Chatham House. Jim, Lord O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
President Zelensky has said that the price we have to pay for avoiding a third world war is going to be higher energy bills, increases in the cost of living, and a reduction in living standards. And this comes at a time where we see from our BAV Best Countries study that softer values, sort of like quality of life and social purpose, are much more important in defining a nation's brand. But do you think that public opinion at the moment will pressurise governments to hold their current policies, or do you think they will start to look at alternatives?
Nice, easy question that you start with. I don't know, because it is probably for my generation, never mind the younger generation, the first such issue of this scale and complexity that we've seen. So far, it appears Western nations, who are the prime supporters of Ukraine, of course, have been happy to support the government stance on Ukraine. and superficially accept the cost, which is essentially this enormous cost of living shock. But it remains to be seen how that passes the test of time. So as we're seeing here, the government itself is almost definitely going to have to pay for the cost of this dilemma. I can't help finishing my answer to this very tricky question by also pointing out that if we really want to be serious about climate change and alternative energies, having a permanently higher price for carbon emitting energy forms is probably ultimately the sort of thing that is needed. One would imagine accelerate the desire for alternative energies to become more and more part of everyday life.
Now, you were chairman of the Chatham House, one of the world's leading think tanks. Its mission of a world that is sustainable, secure and prosperous is great. What do you feel, how far are we from realising that goal?
Isn't and hasn't really worked the way it's supposed to do on the tin.
So Jim, what should the priorities of nations be then now?
Yeah, so to what should we do about it? You know, I've become linked to a number of things I've been involved in, a big believer in what I broadly call profit with purpose. And we need to have business itself think more about the societal remit of who ultimately they serve. We've lived in an era, and still do, of where the only thing that matters for many, certainly publicly quoted business, is the shareholder. And it's not enough. And private business shouldn't be rewarded if we don't have productivity that goes with these big gains for them. And policymakers need to be more alert to the realities of life rather than just what was in economic textbooks of the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't learn from that, I have a fear that some of the dilemmas that have just blown up dramatically in the past few years out of nowhere could actually get worse.
Now, we started with a hard question, so let's end with an easy one. Lord O'Neill, are you an optimist or a pessimist given the situation we see around the world today?
Right now, I feel a lot more pessimistic than I've done for a long time. However, that said, I've been around the policy area in many different forms for over 40 years, and I've lived through a lot of crises. And the one thing I know for sure is that the crisis you're in, even though it often seems the worst you've ever been through, they come to an end. And one of the big things I've learned is never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, the making of a business, a leader, or of a country is how they respond to the crisis you are in, because it normally defines how you're going to deal with the future era. So in that sense, there are lots of ways of things that could emerge from all of this mess in a more positive way.
Well, Lord Jim O'Neill, ending on a slightly more positive note than we started, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a privilege to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me joining you.
As we travel around the world together in our Follow the Sun broadcast, we'll be hearing news, views and insights from local WPP company colleagues in 24 of the 85 countries covered in the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022. Now, before we go to one of those countries, let's remind ourselves of the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 rankings from the 85th down to the number 1 country. let's see what the overall findings of Best Countries 2022 are before we go to the WPP team. And don't forget to download the Best Countries Metaverse experience for even more global insights from the address on your screen. Historically, military power and finance, banks and tanks were the attributes against which we measured a country's power in the world. Not anymore. So what does all this mean? It shows that a nation focused on providing great quality of life for its people, which cares about the rights and equality, and has a focus on entrepreneurship, is seen as having the most powerful nation brand. This reflects a world today and the factors that influence public perceptions and consumer decision-making, and by implication, a nation's political policy making. So let's take a look at those 10 factors and their weights for 2022. Entrepreneurship, 14.2%. Cultural influence, 10.4%. Power, 5%. Heritage, 3.1%. Adventure, 5.5%. Quality of life, 14.5%. Open for business, 9.3%. Social purpose, 13.5%. Agility, 14%. Movers, 10.6%. So it's clearly no longer just tanks and banks that give a country influence around the world. Softer power, which comes about as a result of entrepreneurship and cultural exports, is increasingly making an impact.
Tucked away in the northernmost corner of Europe with 10 million inhabitants, Sweden is quite well known and liked in most parts of the world. Through the years, the image of Sweden has been greatly influenced by global export brands like IKEA, cultural exports like ABBA and Avicii, sport exports like Zlatan, and a strong voice on matters of social justice and climate change, for example, Greta Thunberg. The enduring romantic idea that we are all still Vikings living in a pristine landscape, drinking mead and shouting umlauts at each other is of course mostly a myth. But if you visit Sweden around midsummer, you may be excused for thinking this is not a myth. Just like most countries in the world, Sweden is much more diverse and dynamic a place than most people think. And Sweden scoring well on social purpose and quality of life should perhaps not come as a surprise, as these values play an important part both in culture, politics and business.
I think in Sweden the ideas of quality of life and social purpose are not just a matter of politics. It's also very much a part of the way we try to do business. This is maybe a little bit different from how some other countries and cultures see where there is, more of a tension and sometimes even a conflict between running businesses for profit on one hand and promoting a good life and a just and sustainable society on the other. Balancing these ambitions, it's so important to businesses in Sweden that when we are meeting with our clients, we do that in what we at Mindshare call a huddle. It's a kind of an informal conference to learn more and discuss different topics and questions. And this year, it was called Taking Care of Business, with an emphasis on the caring part. And we had these amazing speakers that shared their experience and perspective on, it was everything from living your dream life as an entrepreneur to the power of diversity that comes from having employees and market segments with origins from all over the world. To try to integrate this thinking with the harsh reality of competitive and ever-changing market situations, it requires a lot of flexibility and also willingness to try new stuff. So I guess that's why Sweden also scores pretty high on the agility rating. And of course, this was also reflected in the huddle setup, where we also did sessions on, for example, branded mobile gaming as a way to reach your target audience in new and exciting ways. Yeah, I mean, the will to promote and integrate business with social good is by no means uniquely Swedish. If we just look at Mindshare globally, the positioning rests on the idea of good growth that really finds its power in this kind of thinking. But in Sweden, we just have a long tradition of this, and as a result, we often look for possibilities to have business interests aligned with more long-term, people-oriented benefits. In fact, a couple of years ago, before Mindshare globally launched a good growth platform, we in Sweden introduced a similar idea called Dare to be Good. So it's nice to see that more parts of the world is moving in this direction, because to us it feels absolutely natural. And then, of course, we have some challenges all over the world, but that's another story.
Now, how did we get here? There is this, maybe, unusual mix of empathy, responsibility and capitalism in the Swedish national tradition since more than a century back. Let's call it the ego collective. You can't exploit or even disappoint other people, but it's more than okay to shoot for the stars and go for your dreams. This is much the same in all the Nordic countries. As a result of this, Sweden has historically been the starting place of global companies like IKEA, H&M and Volvo. And in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen the rise of unicorns like Spotify and Klarna, Skype and Mojang. Mojang, they are the creators of Minecraft. Some of these have been founded by people from an immigrant background, like Sebastian Simatowicz, who created Klarna and whose parents are from Poland. Surprisingly, many times the good news is that there is nothing new. Swedish cultural values are very stable over time, even if political leanings vary. In Sweden, there is a long tradition of trust in other people, which makes it easier to invest in community resources, extend credit, allow benefits, and to opt for recommendations instead of regulation. This is reflected in the trust for democratic authorities. For example, during the COVID-19 period, Sweden never went into lockdown and never closed schools for kids younger than 15. Authorities simply told people to stay at home and keep a distance whenever possible, and most people did. Another example of the typically Swedish social solutions based on this mentality is the generous parental leave policies. 480 days per child to be split between parents. This concept is taken very seriously by Swedish companies, some choosing to extend these benefits to employees all over the world as far as economically possible. A famous example is Swedish car manufacturer Volvo, that instituted 24 weeks of parental leave, regardless of gender, as a global employee benefit. Does all this sound strange to you? For Swedes it doesn't, but on a global scale, is this normal behaviour? No, not much. Sweden is pretty much an outlier country, sitting in the absolute extreme of the scale in the World Value Study that is conducted since 2005. For Swedes, this is both a badge of honour and a reminder that our view of the world is perhaps not very representative. So, if you have your roots in this arguably odd cultural starting point, what is it like to experience other cultures? Well, here are some thoughts from Mindshare Sweden's Mikael Kristensson.
I left Sweden when I was in my early 20s and moved to London. After about 6 years, I moved over to Singapore, where I spent over 8 years working at Mindshare across Asia Pacific before returning home. Having grown up in Sweden, but spent more than half my life abroad, I find this notion of the ego collective really interesting. Wherever I lived, Swedes tended to have really good reputations. It didn't matter if they were like tenants, co-workers, even talking to the locals as we were traveling and exploring Asia, Swedes as tourists had a good reputation. This got me quite curious, because it's not kind of what you expect being in Sweden, thinking about how we were in our teens as tourists in other places. I started asking around with some of the locals in the different places I visited, why do you think that Swedes are so nice, and why do you think Swedes have such a good reputation here? And what they very often came back to was this kind of caring nature of Swedes to look for the needs of others and the things around them. And that surprised me a bit being in Asia, because it's not like other cultures are not collectively oriented, maybe even more so than Swedes, especially in Asia where it's kind of the bedrock of their society. But still, it doesn't really manifest in the same way. It's not that same, let's just organize things for the better, for everyone, kind of attitude that Swedes default to. We want to take care of the group, we want to take care of our belongings, the place where we live, independently if it's ours or someone else and we rent it. I think a key difference is how the Swedes almost always want to approach things, especially conflicts, as negotiated, connected systems. Instead of pushing your own agenda, your own needs or desires against another person or another group, Swedes tend to fight for that fundamental system that will set up a bigger, more just and fair situation for all. So we do think that benefits ourselves as individuals within that collective. In a way, it's kind of sneaky, because it kind of looks like you're transparent and you're caring for everyone else, but you're doing it out of self-interest because you think interacting in a positive way and having a positive impact on the community around you will benefit yourself and yours and whatever that, whether that be a company, a family or a community. You also find out, traveling around the world and living in other cultures, there are many different ways to do things. It's not always the Swedish way that's the best, or the European way of that matter. There are very many things that are much smarter, more effective in other countries. For example, in the Philippines, they have an amazing outlook on life and they're always so happy. They can see the light in every situation. Our Swedish way, instead of negotiating, anchoring decision, taking everything seriously and through a long process with a larger, bigger group, can sometimes take forever, and you just want someone to take that situation, grip it, make the decision and move on. Get people into line and align to that decision and move with it. One of the key things I really bring back from Singapore is this saying of better done than perfect. It's something that we really need to sometimes move forward with to Sweden without forgetting that idea of the better for everyone.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted now to be joined by Dr. Stacey Graham, who is the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP. Stacey, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year we see social purpose becoming significantly important, which is a good thing. Why do you think that's so?
I believe in the survey you define social purpose around a few categories such as caring about gender and racial equity, the environment, human rights, and so forth, right? And what we understand about humans is we have an innate desire to have a reason for being. That's another word for purpose. So I'd say if we look at what's happened in the world in the last 2.5, 3 years, that is definitely catapulted into the mainstream. We have all these things coming together that are pinpointing, illustrating how we're failing as a collective.
And do you think that failure as a collective is something that's now being exposed right across the globe?
Absolutely. I would say that even before 2020, we could see it happening, but there's something about a restriction of freedom of movement, right, that makes people sit at home and have nothing else to do but recognize and look into everything that's wrong with the world, if you will. And so I think that it's on people's minds. What does it mean to be in a collective when I'm sitting at home and can't leave my house anymore? What does it mean to really be connected as a society? How do we care for the most vulnerable? And to be really honest, with COVID-19, we didn't do a great job of that. So I think people are asking different questions than they were 2 to 3 years ago.
And I think I found it quite interesting to see the relationship between this movement, I mean, let's call it a movement, coming from the population upwards.
Absolutely. I mean, we also see that some of our health officials do move more politically than we would have expected. But there were people across the world who made the decision to wear a mask even when it was no longer mandated, who stayed at home even when they didn't want to, who got on the streets for probably the largest social movement since 1968, right? It was a global social movement to bring awareness to racial inequality. So I think there's a coming together even in times of divisiveness.
Now, one of the things we've seen in the study is this sort of interrelationship between a country's brand and companies' brands, and we're seeing that interrelationship even more sort of mingled and prevalent this year. So what should companies do to improve their social purpose in relation to how their country is seen?
That is a great question. I think that is something that they're still figuring out. But one thing we know for sure is people aren't simply incentivized by money. That's not enough to keep employees today. Employees want to work somewhere where they feel proud of not only the work that they do, but the things that the company stands for. They want to see their company standing up for social issues that they personally care about.
Stacey, why do you think suddenly companies are finding a political voice as opposed to purely a corporate voice?
I think to an extent, we have been able to observe this shift away. When I studied, there was a clear connection. The business strategy has to align with shareholder value. That's all we care about, maximizing shareholder value. And there was a notion that maximizing shareholder value stood in opposition to a social purpose, if you will. And today, I think people are recognizing that's actually not true. And we increase shareholder value when we can ensure that we have high employee engagement, low turnover, and people care about what they do in the company they work for.
Well, Stacey Graham, that's a fantastic place to stop. This whole topic is something that we are all going to have to understand a lot better, and not just understand it, but also ensure that it's actions as opposed to merely words. But for the moment, Dr. Stacey Graham, the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Hello and a very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. Thank you very much indeed for joining me in this very special metaverse experience. exploring the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 study in conjunction with Wharton Business School and US News. Here we are in the arrivals hall, where you'll be able to discover the key insights from this year's study relating to global trends. Here you'll also find exclusive interviews with global experts and analysis of the data. And what a year we've had. There have been a lot of changes from last year. From here you can also go and visit the 85 countries that are ranked in this year's report. Each of those countries have their own individual room where you can explore a wealth of data and insights into each individual country. You might well see some surprises along your journey. And in the departure area, you can discover more about the study itself. Enjoy your trip around the BAV Best Countries 2022 Metaverse. Well, we're almost at the end of our broadcast. A big thanks to everybody from the local WPP companies who've participated, and of course our central team that's put together all of our Follow the Sun 24 hours of broadcasting, to our directors, to Indas Gupta, to Paul Reifer, and our producers, Sarah Cousins and Lady Victoria Robinson. Well, all it's left for me, David Roth at WPP, to say thank you very much indeed for joining, and the next broadcast follows shortly on the hour.
if you're done.